we will be transformed before the Earth. The Earth will eventually be swallowed up by the sun, but long before that happens, we as a human species will be transformed.
It's completely reasonable, and I think almost common sense to conclude that there is a plan, that there is a purpose. And I think John is justified in extrapolating and saying, well, if a long time ago the universe just had rocks, and then it had life that could move rocks around, and that had us that could think about the meaning of moving rocks around, what's so ridiculous about thinking that there could be an even another higher level of evolution?
Hello and welcome to today's show. If you're watching here on YouTube, do make sure to give today's video a like, subscribe to the channel. It helps others to discover the content as well. And if you'd like more from Unbelievable, do check out the info with today's show. You can find our newsletter there, loads of bonus content when you register. Well, today we're asking about the future of humankind. Should we be more optimistic about it? John Hands is a scientist and academic who received wide praise for his last book, Cosmosapiens, published in 2016. On the origin of evolution of humans in the universe from start to finish, and his brand new book, The Future of Humankind, looks forward to what may lay in store for Homo sapiens, examining whether we're likely to go extinct, for instance, or whether we may be set for a further stage of evolution, a new consciousness as we continue in development. Well, in conversation with John today is a friend of the show, Perry Marshall, whose own interests in a new understanding of the development of life have been expressed in his books, Evolution 2.0, and his long-running $10 million prize for anyone who thinks they can crack the code for the origin of life. And we've had Perry on discussing these kinds of issues with all kinds of different people in the past. Today, though, we'll be asking where the future of humanity as a species lies, how Perry, as a Christian, sees God's activity in life's development in the cosmos, how John sees things as well. We'll let John explain where he lands on the God question. I'm sure that will come up as we get into today's discussion. But John and Perry, welcome along to the show.
Great to be here.
Great.
Thanks so much, John. Let's hear from you first of all, as someone who's new to the show. You seem to be something of a polymath in some ways. You've got a real kind of interest in all kinds of areas. Where has your own interest in specifically evolution, the development of humanity, and now trying to map out what the future may hold? Where has that all sprung from in your own life, John?
Well, when my wife died, I started asking questions. What is it all about? What are we? Where do we come from? And being a trained scientist, I decided I'd take a scientific view and look at the evidence of what do we know. What does the evidence show us about where we came from, what we are? And so this is what I did. And that resulted in the book Cosmosapiens, Human Evolution from the Origin of the Universe. But having finished it, I then thought, well, what's our future? And I decided to take the same view. And I began by evaluating current major predictions, which I put into three categories. One, extinction by natural disasters, including pandemics, by nuclear war or accident, by artificial intelligence, or by population explosion and climate change. Second category, survival, by colonizing space, as proposed by Elon Musk, among others, or by extending individual health spans and achieving immortality. And third, transformation, by uploading individual minds to computers or to holograms. I consulted with leading scientists in specialist fields to assess contradictory claims in order to reach my conclusions. And as a result, I argue that although the three categories of predictions are very different, there's three things in common. They are speculations starting from the then current level of scientific development. They have a very low, if not negligible, probability of being realized, and in those cases where specific predictions can be tested against outcomes, all have been disproven. And they make the implicit assumption that the future of the human species is determined by the future of individual humans. By contrast, the unique forecast in this book projects into the future the distinct pattern in the scientific evidence of an accelerating cosmic evolutionary process over some 15 billion years up to the present. And it is this that produces the optimistic outcome.
It's a fascinating project, and I'd love to return to, in a sense, that life experience that obviously prompted its genesis, if you like. But it strikes me just from reading the book, reading between the lines a little bit, John, that your first book obviously received quite wide acclaim. It was a prize-winning book. Lots of famous people who sort of endorsed it. I get the sense that some of your conclusions you've come to in this book are a little bit more controversial in some respects, particularly some of the way you assess the danger of, for instance, climate change and conflict and war and that sort of thing. I got the sense that you think that some of what we're hearing today in the world around that is too alarmist, and you don't think it's nearly as likely at all as that it will be the kind of cataclysmic issue that some people say. Was that something that I don't know that people did critique you for when you did submit draft chapters and that kind of thing?
Yes. For example, on climate change, I submitted a draft chapter to one climate scientist, and she began by being very helpful. She even corrected double spaces where I hadn't intended double spaces. She was going into very great detail. And then suddenly she came up against the fact that I had concluded on the basis of evidence that most of the predictions of the climate scientists, and even the predictions of the International Panel on Climate Change, were not accurate. And at that point, she stopped and said, I'm not going to go any further with this. 97% of people believe the opposite. So you're a climate change denier, which is actually nonsense. I can go into that 97%. That was a complete farce. But on the predictions by the International Panel on Climate Change, it's most of it's all become extremely binary now. But I think I should declare an interest. Let me say first of all, I respect the sincerity of many non-scientists who want to save the planet and believe that human extinction and prevent human extinction by global warming. And nearly all believe that this warming of the climate is caused by humans emitting greenhouse gases, and in particular carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. So let me give a declaration of interest. I gave up my car in 2004 in favour of cycling, or it is not possible, using public transport. I've taken only one airplane journey since 2006, all because I want to minimise my contribution to any climate change that could prove disastrous for undeveloped communities at sea level. But as for the belief that climate change caused by humans emitting greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere, would cause human extinction, Chapter 4 of the book examines the scientific evidence and shows this belief to be unfounded. For example, it shows, among other things, that climate change is caused by a multiplicity of interacting factors, each operating over different timescales. Now, there are predictable ones like orbital shape. The shape of the Earth's orbit around the Sun, referred to as its eccentricity, varies over 100,000 years. These changes in distance from the Sun affect the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. The axis of rotation. The Earth's axis of rotation is tilted with respect to its orbital direction, and this axial tilt varies between 21.1 degree and 24.5 degrees over a cycle of about 41,000 years. We are now in a decreasing phase of this cycle, which promotes an overall cooling trend and has contributed to Earth's periodic ice ages. Among the unpredictable ones are solar flares, which have been more active in the second half of the 20th century than at any time in the previous 1,150 years. Other unpredictable factors include changes in ocean currents. These have triggered dramatic temperature fluctuations in the past, such as those in 12,900 to 11,700 before the present, that resulted in a temperature drop of between 2 and 6 degrees and advances of glaciers over much of the northern hemisphere.
So I get the sense then in all of this, John, that you're saying it's complex, we need to be nuanced, we need to follow the evidence.
Yeah.
You're concerned that certain ideologies are overriding a strict adherence to the scientific approach that you would like to see in this. And I should stress that this is not a book about climate change. It's just one small part of a much wider sort of case you're making for but obviously I could imagine that in particular would have been one of the chapters or segments of a chapter that caused some eyebrows or consternation and so on to raise. So it's just interesting because you're obviously someone who, in a sense, is not afraid of, as it were, going against the grain, possibly, of what the wider communities. Now, this is why I think it's interesting to bring you on with Perry, who also strikes me as a sort of independent thinker, let's say, who has also sort of charted his own path in terms of looking into origins of life, evolutionary explanations for life and that kind of thing. And I think that's where you both crossed paths in the past before this book was published. Perry, why don't you tell us, about how you got to know John's work and what you make of his particular way of looking at these issues?
Well, I ran across this book, Cosmosapiens, in 2016. And when I first saw it, it's about a 700-page book. And it says, we're starting from the very beginning of the universe and we're going all the way to the flourishing of humanity. And we are going to ask, are the current scientific explanations of these things correct or not? And my first thought was, that is almost obnoxious mission to propose that you could pull this off in one book. But he did. I was very impressed with it. And he starts with the Big Bang and he goes through problems with cosmology and all of that, and then goes into origin of life and you get evolution and modern human consciousness. And he did a superb job with all of it. He came to nearly identical evolution conclusions as I did, even though he and I had never spoken or communicated. I didn't know anything about his existence. And so I was very impressed. And there's very few people that could do something like that. And so I reached out to him. We became friends. We met up a couple of times in London. And so then his new book came out. And one of the things that always happens with these kind of issues is they polarize. And this is even more true now with current social media than it used to be. And with any of these divisive issues, you have the Hatfields and the McCoys, and now they're angry at each other and they won't give an inch. And what John did in Cosmosapiens and what he's now doing with the Future of Humanity is he's taking a nuanced view and he's taking it piece by piece, and he's saying, what does the evidence actually say? And so the climate change chapter is a perfect example. And John said, look, I haven't taken an airplane since 2006, and I sold my car in 2004, and I bike and take. So John is clearly very serious about the environment. And like, as for myself, all I had to do was land at the Beijing airport and look out the window, and I knew that we had an environmental problem. One day in a large city in China is all you need to know that the environment is an issue. So I don't have any issue with that either. But I think both of us feel like it's been artificially polarized into this black and white thing. Well, you're either for us or against us. You either completely agree with us or you're a nutcase. And John had the courage to take on this question and take it piece by piece by piece. As you heard earlier, he's talking about the changing degree of the axis of the Earth and things like solar flares and what actually causes climate change versus, oh, well, it's clearly cows making methane, right? Or whatever the explanation might be. And so in this day and age, it takes more courage to be a nuanced viewpoint. But that's exactly why I like John's work.
Yeah.
Can I say, Perry, this was brought home to me very vividly when one scientist to whom I sent a draft chapter, I make a critique of the IPCC's predictions, and it's a balanced critique. And I looked at the evidence, and I sent it to a climate scientist and said, this is what I've written. Please correct any errors, point out where I'm wrong, because I want to get this right. And he emailed back and said, can we speak on the phone? And I said, fine, I'll phone you. So I phoned him and said, I'm speaking off the record. Your comments on the IPCC are absolutely correct. But the debate is because simplistic binary choice. Either you believe the current official line or your views are invalid. He said, as a government employee, I can't say this publicly, but I can assure you that nearly all my colleagues feel exactly the same.
Interesting. Well, look, I want us to move beyond the climate change because it's a fascinating chapter, but it is, as I say, only a relatively small part, albeit an important part of the book. It comes, as you say, in part one of the book, which covers what are the major threats to human survival and extinction, as it were. And you cover other issues that that have been proposed, and by and large, you actually say, on balance, you think actually they really don't pose an imminent or viable threat to the future of humankind. Right. You then go to talk about survival. What about the future? Are things like space colonization a valid possibility in the future? Biotechnology, immortality in some way. And that again was fascinating. I mean, the reason I said polymath is because you really do have an extraordinary grasp on all of these areas. You've obviously managed to summarize it quite succinctly in the book, but I get the sense that it's from a wealth of research and thinking that you've done on this, John. Let's just pick one of those, just because it's rather a contemporary and interesting issue with Elon Musk so often in our news. Space colonization. You say you really don't think that's viable. Do you want to give us a very quick summary position on why you don't think we'll be colonizing space anytime in the future, John?
Yeah. I start that chapter with looking back at previous proposals for space colonization, and this happened in, when was it? The 1970s, when there were very many proposals for space colonization, and they were predicting that we will colonize space, will be completed before the end of the 20th century, and so on. All the predictions were proved false. And if you look at what someone like Elon Musk is proposing now, what he's not taking into account, and what NASA has actually done some research on, but nobody seems to be taking any notice of it, are the dangers of radiation, that those can affect humans very drastically. Now, if you're going to a 6 months mission on a satellite, then okay, you're going to have some effect, but you're going to get away with it. But the idea of actually living in a space colony, the radiation effect will cause premature deaths, infertility, and so on. These haven't. The research has been done by NASA, but nobody seems to take any notice of it. Musk is just. This is. It looks exciting, great. It looks terrific, But all the predictions of colonization of space in the past have been proven wrong. They haven't happened. And I very much doubt, and I think the probability that we will escape by living in colonies in space is simply not backed by the evidence. And I think the probability that this happens is almost negligible, or that will happen is almost negligible.
What's your thoughts on that, Perry?
I think the genius of Elon Musk is knowing what he can say that will kite the stock price while still delivering a product that people will pay for today. So when he talks about colonizing Mars and all of that, it's obviously so far in the future that he does not have to deliver any of that today. But meanwhile, he can do the satellite internet stuff, and he's got paid subscribers, and it's changed the Ukrainian war and all of that. And you got to give him credit. Like, sometimes the genius of a visionary is in both selling the far future, but still fulfilling the present. And Elon Musk does not have to get any colonies in space in his lifetime in order to do 90% of the other stuff that he wants to do. So I just think it's a brilliant marketing strategy.
I completely agree.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to the future of humanity, John, what are the trends we're looking at in terms of population growth, in terms of, I hear a lot of people saying actually in the West and in certain parts of the world, we're actually seeing a decrease in population, fertility, so on. Others are worried that we're seeing overpopulation and the effects of that. People talk about space colonization often because they fear that we're going to run out of resources on planet Earth. We're going to need to find a new home. Perhaps in the very distant future, the sun at some point will swallow up the Earth or whatever. I mean, what do you think is the long-term future for humanity in that sense? We're not likely to be wiped out by an asteroid. You don't think climate change is necessarily the danger that some people speculate it will be. What do you think is actually the future of us here on Earth? I don't know, in 500,000 years' time, 1 million years' time, where do you think we're going to be?
Well, I think that this is coming on to part 4, because I think that the pattern that I project into the future, it's an accelerating pattern. If I can just give an overview, we'll discuss part 4 in more detail later. We will be transformed before the Earth. I mean, the Earth will eventually be swallowed up by the sun, but long before that happens, we as a human species will be transformed. So that's the short answer without going into details of what is in part 4.
Now, part 3 of the book is called Transformation, and this is perhaps a little different to the to the kind of transformation you're talking about. We will come to that, but there are people who want to press towards certain types of transformation. For instance, transhumanism, digital immortality. Yuval Noah Harari and others, Nick Bostrom, they've written and spoken on this idea that we need to transcend our, physical limitations as Homo sapiens. What do you think of those prospects of us doing it for ourselves, kind of biotech, transhumanism, whatever it might be, uploading our consciousness to the cloud? Do you think that that's the kind of transformation that is in store for humans?
No, I don't. And I examine all the different predictions. I mean, you mentioned Nick Bostrom. I mean, interestingly enough, he wrote one paper predicting one human future, and then he wrote a book 6 months later predicting exactly the opposite. Yuval Harari produced a book called Homo Deus, which is about the future, where he actually doesn't make any serious predictions about the future. I mean, it's actually, I bought it because I thought another prediction of the future, and I looked through it and I read it twice, and he's talking back to what he'd said before in Sapiens, and there's virtually nothing about the future. And what he does predict about the future is completely disprovable. I mean, for example, he thinks that AI will is the magic solution, artificial intelligence, and this will this will cause. We can use artificial intelligence to develop into the future, but he completely ignores all the negative evidence. I mean, artificial intelligence can exceed individual functions that the human can undertake in particular fields. But what artificial intelligence cannot do is reflect on itself. First of all, it needs to be set up by humans, and then it cannot reflect on itself, and it can only do one thing at a time. But humans are unique in that we can do a multiplicity of factors. Sure, artificial intelligence can maybe write better than we can. It can develop computer programs far better than we can. It can do a lot of individual things, but it cannot do all of them, and it cannot reflect on what it has done and change its predictions and change itself. So I don't think the future of that artificial intelligence.
You don't think in that sense the future, that technology is what's going to save us in the future in that sense?
That's right.
Yeah. Perry,
so
I'd be interested in quick thoughts, and then we will go to a break and launch into I think what will be the meat of the metaphysical kind of conversation, which is part 4. But any thoughts on what John had to share there?
Well, I live in an artificial intelligence world because I've written books on Google, Facebook, TikTok, and very soon YouTube advertising. And so I and my clients live and die by what the algorithms are doing. And of course, I'm very interested in evolution. And there's a paper by James Shapiro, very thoroughly researched, called All Living Cells Are Cognitive. And it makes a very compelling case that all living things have some degree of self-awareness all the way down to the cellular level. And as an electrical engineer, I can absolutely promise you, no matter how smart ChatGPT gets, it's not self-aware. There's nobody home.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people know this. There's a few people that seem to be not quite sure. And that's exactly the point. John, in his Cosmosapiens book, he talks about self-reflective intelligence, and we all know what it is to introspect and to think about ourselves and ask ourselves, are we being reasonable, and all of that. And computers don't do that at all. And so they're running on a completely different plane. And so I don't, the notion that we're going to upload ourselves into the cloud, I think, is complete nonsense. It sells books and it's very popular among some circles, but it's really just a pop religion.
Yeah, interesting. We're covering lots of interesting ground today on the show. My guests today are John Hands and Perry Marshall. John is the author of the book Cosmosapiens and his new book, The Future of Humankind, Why We Should Be Optimistic. Perry Marshall is the author of Evolution 2.0 and the prize associated with it. We'll be back as we think about, we're going to be examining John's really interesting proposal as to what he thinks the next phase of evolution for humans might look like, what that will mean for us. And I think we'll end up talking about God as well along the way. So join us for part 2 of the show coming up very shortly.
Historians don't argue that something that happened only once in all of history is the most probable occurrence because somebody said it happened.
Unless there's incredible evidence.
The incredible evidence is that Paul said
Not just
so?
that. Not just that. Where was the expectation of a Messiah rising again from the dead? Tell me that.
How many ancient Christian writings do we have by somebody who says in those writings that he saw Jesus? No.
No, this is my turn.
Let me finish.
Let me finish my point.
I'm answering your question.
You weren't answering the question.
You asked me my question,
Okay.
and
I'll
I'm
let you
answering
finish.
it.
All right, let's let Bart finish.
That was the exciting part when we arm wrestle.
Hello and welcome back. Really interesting, wide-reaching conversation today. Just one of those sort of interesting dialogues, I would say. We're not looking at a bruising sparring match on the show today between Perry Marshall and John Hands. Just two people interested in biology, evolution, physics, technology, and the future of humankind. That's the title of John Hands' new book. So really, in that last segment, we sort of covered the first sort of 3 major parts of the book, John, very briefly, where you look at prospects for extinction, prospects for survival, prospects for transformation of humankind. And then you end with really what is a more kind of metaphysical or spiritual account of what the future may hold for humans. And again, this, to me, speaks to the independence of your thinking, that these are not views that are necessarily mainstream in the scientific community, things that people tend to even count within science very often. But you have a view that actually humanity is due for another phase of evolution that will sort of, transform our consciousness in some way. Do you want to just paint a picture for us of what this looks like, where this reasoning of yours comes from?
Yeah. I looked at the evolution of humans from the origins of the universe, and there are 4 stages in it. First of all, energy. Because evidence of the start of the universe is not obtainable, we've no choice but to rely on metaphysical conjecture. And the conjecture adopted by most cosmologists is that the universe, including space and time, together with a single force of nature, erupted into existence from nothing, as a point-like fireball of radiation in a hot Big Bang. As the universe rapidly expanded and cooled, the gravitational force separated out from the single universal force of nature to leave a grand unified force. This eventually condensed out to form matter. Through a process of complexification, this matter gave rise to planets, including Earth. That's the first start of our evolution, going right back from the beginning. And then the second stage of our evolution is life. At some point, and we don't know precisely when because the evidence has been destroyed, life emerged on Earth. And the simplest independent life form, the bacterium, is immensely more complex than non-life forms. And unlike matter, life forms possess consciousness and mobility. Now, these life forms evolved into more complex life forms, such as chimpanzees. And each such animal formed one group that inhabits one area, and they're governed by two instincts, survival and procreation. So even most advanced chimpanzees, you only find really one group. If there's a battle, the loser is expelled from that group, and the male is dominant. And that's what their instinct is: survival, procreation. The third stage of evolution is humans. Between some 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, humans emerged on Earth. Now, they were distinguished from other life forms, not by the shape of their head or whatever. They were distinguished from all other life forms by possessing not only consciousness, but also reflective consciousness. They not only knew, they knew that they knew. And unlike other life forms, they form a multiplicity of social groups, from families, tribes, nations, and international bodies with different purposes. Unlike other animals, they spread all over the planet and ventured into space. Now, this reflective consciousness developed a growing cooperation, altruism, complexification, and convergence that contrasted with the inherited instincts of competition, aggression, hierarchism, and divergence. And there's one particular figure. I mean, this is the book, The Future of Humankind.
Yes.
It should be optimistic. But on page 216, there's figure 1319. And it shows patterns in the evolution of modern humans. So it's a wavy line. It's not a straightforward pattern. It's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. But this pattern of cooperation, reflective consciousness producing cooperation, altruism, complexification, and convergence is increasing. But we're still governed by our inherited instincts of competition, aggression, hierarchism, and divergence, which is decreasing at some point. And the instinct is actually still governing our behavior. But it's accelerating progress. At some point in the future, and the not too distant future, that will overcome our instincts. So we've still got these instincts. We still have wars. I mean, you've got Ukraine, but if you look at the whole pattern, the number of wars has actually decreased over time. If you look at, I mean, the only thing about nuclear warfare, that if you look at nuclear weapons, that the number peaked a massive total in 1985, and that's decreased. So the whole pattern is of change.
I mean, can I leap in here, John? Because I mean, what you're describing there sounds a little bit like the sort of Steven Pinker argument, you know, from The Better Angel of Our Nature and so on, where he quite convincing, I think, shows the ways in which, contrary to the popular headlines, you know, actually child mortality, poverty, by most markers is actually decreasing, and that we're seeing increasing prosperity in various ways. Now, obviously, the critics will then sort of point to, well, look at the 20th century, our relatively recent past, the bloodiest century in which the most people died in warfare of any other century. So to some extent, is it about the kind of the way you look at the facts? And obviously there are those who would say even in a relatively prosperous West and so on, we've kind of, the problems we used to have of malnutrition and war perhaps have been replaced by new problems of our own making to do with technology and so on, because we see skyrocketing anxiety, suicide rates among men are higher than they've ever been in the past. I suppose there are those who want to say, is it all getting better, essentially, or not?
Yes, it is. If you look at, you mentioned deaths through warfare, but if you look, but that is because the world population has been increasing enormously. So if you look at deaths from warfare as a percentage of the human population, that has been decreasing. You can't just pick out the number and say it's increasing. Yes, of course it is. But the population is increasing. So as a proportion of it, it's decreasing.
When we do look at a recent event like the war in Ukraine, I think part of the reason why it has shocked so many people is because it has come in the wake of a relatively stable past 60, 70 years, obviously since World War II in Europe, where actually, and peace and stability has been more the norm in recent, the last century, whereas if you were to go back to previous centuries, you would find it actually that is not necessarily the norm.
Yeah, as I said, Justin, our progress isn't smooth. It's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. With the war in Ukraine, this is a step back. Of course it is. But looking at the pattern, which is what I'm trying to do, looking at the overall pattern.
That's really interesting. Now, you characterize this, therefore, as a sort of us moving along towards a kind of, as you say, reflective consciousness, and we're sort of that instinct, if you like, that's developing in humans is gradually overtaking the instincts for competition, aggression, divergent hierarchism, and so on. Let's pass over to Perry. Do you agree with this kind of the way that John sketches the nature in which the way in which humans are developing in this 4th stage of our evolution, Perry?
One of the things I like about John's view is he's not wedded to a purely materialistic way of framing the world. So if you hear somebody say a truly evolved society would find a way to produce affordable healthcare for all of its members, when that person says evolved, they are not using that word in a traditional Darwinian sense at all. But everybody still knows what they mean. And John, I think, tell me if I'm right, John, I think you're saying that there is a different axis of evolution that is self-reflective, that is maybe exhibited by, we're trying to reduce cruelty to animals. There's movements towards vegetarian veganism, of seeing humanity as one big family rather than as a bunch of competing tribes, that is very far from the kind of origin of species mentality that it seems like most of science has been stuck with and stuck in. And you're saying this is real. This is very much a part of our awareness, and it seems to be over time on the increase. Am I hearing you right, John?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. But so I think that this is growing, but those are the first 3 stages of our evolution, and I'm looking here at the 4th stage of human evolution. And if we continue the pattern of cooperation, complexification, and convergence, it strongly suggests a radical break for the 4th stage of evolution. It will not be an an evolution of individual humans, but an evolution of humans as a whole. Through cooperation, the reflective consciousness of individuals has been groping towards a shared human consciousness that reflects on itself, its future, and the cosmos of which it knows it is a part. Now, just as the cooperation of some thousands of millions of cells in one human brain generates a complex reflective consciousness for that individual human, so the cooperation of thousands of millions of human minds will generate a complex reflective consciousness for those participating humans. And I'm suggesting this consciousness will not be anchored in individual human minds. In stage 2 of our evolution, individual life forms escape the immobility of their inanimate roots to evolve in a supported habitat. In stage 3, individual humans cooperated to escape the supported habitat in which they had emerged and to spread throughout the planet. In stage 4, the collective mind that emerges will most likely evolve to escape its biological roots and spread throughout the universe as a cosmic consciousness. Now, I'm going from scientific analysis now to philosophical speculation, because I think there is a higher reality that humans now, in the third stage of evolution, are incapable of understanding, just as rocks cannot understand the sun provides light and warmth, and chimpanzees cannot understand the existence of black holes. So I'm speculating that in its fourth stage of evolution, the human cosmic consciousness will be able to comprehend such a higher reality. Furthermore, the human cosmic consciousness may well constitute that higher reality and be the cause of all the physical and chemical laws and parameters that enable it to evolve in an eternal, continuous cycle of self-creation. That is, it forms a cosmic consciousness that underlies everything and from which everything unfolds. That existence of such an eternal, continuous cycle of self-creation seems a much more reasonable explanation to me than the proposition that the universe exploded into existence from nothing, together with a series of uncaused laws and parameters. So I'm suggesting that this continuous cycle of self-creation, some may even call it God.
Yes. Well, that is the sort of bombshell on which the book ends, as it were. That is the final sentence of the book. Some may even call it God. I think possibly the first time really God has been explicitly mentioned in the book, right there in the last sentence. I mean, this is fascinating to me. There are lots of ideas that I've had circulating in this sort of arena. You know, I've seen, for instance, in recent years, the concept of panpsychism, you know, becoming quite popular among a number of philosophers and thinkers. This idea that meaning and consciousness is the fundamental kind of constituent of reality, not simply physical stuff. And it feels like there's been a movement to some extent, even in academia, slightly away from that hard physicalist, materialist sort of perspective that you yourself seem to be also skeptical of, John. But then I can imagine a lot of your scientific colleagues sort of saying, well, I like the first 3/4 of the book, John, when you were sort of concentrating on science and just, you know, coming away with, you know, your predictions and so on from that. This feels like you're now entering a kind of spooky theological / spiritual prognostications about things. So where does, I suppose I'm just interested, where does John the scientist end and John the kind of spiritual philosopher begin in this sort of
Justin, it's not obviously a scientific prediction, but it stems from an analysis of the current scientific orthodoxy, that says that the universe exploded into nothing, and it then produced they're all parameters that we wouldn't exist unless there were so many different parameters, ratios of energy to matter.
The fine-tuning of the universe, effectively, is what you're describing.
Fine-tuning. So many things are fine-tuned, without which life wouldn't exist at all. And all this fine-tuning, these parameters, the ratios of matter to energy, and so on, there's a whole vast array of them, formed out of nothing, spontaneously. Well, this doesn't make sense to me. It's not scientifically tenable, because there's no scientific evidence for this at all. But that is a belief. And because I thought that belief was so unreasonable, I'm looking for, and it is speculation, so it stems from a view that current scientific orthodoxy cannot be right. So what could be more reasonable way for the universe to unfold and evolve? And as I said, it seemed to be the existence of an eternal, continuous cycle of self-creation seems a more reasonable explanation, that the universe exploded into existence from nothing with uncaused laws and parameters. So it is a speculation, sure, but derives from my disagreement with the current scientific orthodoxy on the origin of the universe.
Perry, I'd be interested in your thoughts on John's thesis.
Well, the materialistic narrative does not fit the material facts. Any physicist can tell you about the cosmological constant and that the expansion rate of the universe has to be just within this very, very, very tiny degree of precision in order for even stars to exist. And so it's completely reasonable, and I think almost common sense, to conclude that there is a plan, that there is a purpose. And I think John is justified in extrapolating and saying, well, if a long time ago the universe just had rocks, and then it had life that could move rocks around, and then it had us that could think about the meaning of moving rocks around, what's so ridiculous about thinking that there could be even another higher level of evolution? And is it really any coincidence that you will find this sort of an idea in dozens of ancient religious texts? And that John's scientific thinking would converge with ancient traditional thinking, that they really aren't in conflict at all? Isn't that interesting?
Well, I'll tell you what your phrase transformation immediately brought to mind to me, John, and it's a verse from the Bible where it talks about, on that day we shall all be transformed in the twinkling of an eye, and goes on to talk about that then we shall know and be fully known. Now, I can imagine there are people who hearing what you're saying could sort of fit that sort of big theology, if you like, into something like this. But you're not conventionally religious yourself, John. I mean, you mentioned sort of off air before we began recording that you grew up in a sort of Christian environment and were even, I think, involved in a Catholic union at university. But
I said that I was born and brought up a Catholic, and I remained a Catholic at university, where I was chairman of the College Catholic Society. But I did then look at all the claims for God by all the different religions, and I concluded that nearly all of them are self-contradictory. They contradicted each other. They can't all be right. And so if they are all right, the likelihood that one of them is right is vanishingly small. So I gave up my belief in Christianity then. So I don't believe in.
Did you become an atheist at that point, or?
I initially became an atheist, and then thinking further, I became an agnostic, because a lot of the atheistic beliefs were, I mean, you get people like Richard Dawkins, which they're making the atheism a belief system, which is a religion in itself. So I thought, no, I'm afraid atheism has become a religion of itself. I don't go with that, so I became agnostic. And but then, looking at our future, as I said, this is the conclusion that I came to. I hadn't anticipated I would get here at all. So many of the things that I've concluded, surprised me. And this is one of them. But this is where
and yes, I hesitate to say whether you've, as it were, come back to a sort of belief in God. I mean, it could be described as God. It's a slightly tentative sort of ending for the book. You could even describe it as God.
It's the nature of I say some can call it God. It's the nature of something that far transcends us, and is more logically the cause of things that exist. So, which, broadly speaking, religions, as Perry said, many ancient religions were suggesting things like this. So it's a view of a different definition of the nature of God, if you like.
Yeah, Perry, it'd be interesting your thoughts. We'll go to a break after that and start to kind of maybe crystallize kind of where you land on some of these issues. But yeah, again, what do you make of John's thoughts there?
My favorite professor in university, when I was a junior in college, he said, as people get older, they progress from being obsessed with certainty and numbers, and they major in chemistry or physics or mathematics because they love black and white answers. He said, the older you get, the more mature you get, the more comfortable you are with ambiguity and inexact answers and politics and human beings the way they really are. And I think if you kind of move that more into the professional world, I think, think of a 40-year-old scientist conducting experiments, and that person is typically still very wedded to, as much exact answers as you could possibly get. But I think what naturally happens, you get a little older like John is, the exactness of the answers becomes more and more unsatisfying. And you become almost forced to take a leap into, okay, but what else is there? Because I don't think this is really answering the questions. And I think John's at a stage in his life where he's earned the right to say things like this. You can go read his other books and you can see the other work that he's done. He's clearly a very good researcher and a polymath. And he comes to the end of this book and he says, I think humanity is headed, and life on Earth and the cosmos is headed to something bigger. And that is so much more satisfying of a conclusion than, well, we're just going to have the heat death of the universe and it won't even matter that we were ever here. Like, that's so depressing. Like, no wonder people feel hopeless. Like, why would you ever want to believe that?
Indeed. Well, look, I want to talk about what you believe, Perry, in the next segment, as well as what John believes, and how you put this together as a Christian. Fascinating stuff, though. The Future of Humankind is where we started. We've got on to sort of the end of the universe and the summation of all things, but possibly in God. That's the kind of, that's the kind of conversations we have here on Unbelievable. And my guests today are John Hans and Perry Marshall. We'll be back in just a moment.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.
So today, finishing up the conversation on the future of humankind, I love it when we get sort of just interesting conversations between deep thinkers, and that's one of those sorts of shows today. John Hans and Perry Marshall have joined me. John's new book is called The Future of Humankind, Why We Should Be Optimistic. But it ends at this very interesting place where John gets a bit more speculative, as he said, and says, could we be due for a fourth sort of period of evolution when human consciousness kind of evolves in some way to a different kind of plane, something you might even, look on as godlike. Perry Marshall has also been interested in these kind of big questions around evolution, progress, development, and so on. John, we did, at the very outset of the conversation, you said that what sparked your interest in this whole journey you've been on was the death of your wife and the kind of questions that led to. I hope you won't mind if I ask you what is inevitably a personal question, but does this idea of a kind of a future state in which there is a kind of a oneness to everything, this ultimate state of unified consciousness in the future, does that give you hope that in some sense you will know again the wife that you lost, that there will be some kind of a meaning, a sense to the love and the loss that you experienced in your own life?
There certainly won't be any reproduction of my wife. I'm not. I'm absolutely not. I'm saying that the future is. It's not just speculation. I was driven there by logic to forecast a fourth stage of human evolution beyond our current stage, and that is a collective consciousness. So that's not individual consciousnesses. It's the cooperation of individual consciousness producing a collective consciousness. So there's no sense of individuals having specific identities within this at all.
In that sense, it is, as you say, quite different to our experience now, quite different to the way we do experience life, if that is the direction in which we may be heading. I suppose I was just interested in the sense that you reach quite almost spiritual / theological conclusions in thinking about that, that idea, and whether that did it ultimately give you some comfort, given where you started this quest from.
No, it didn't. I personally, have felt and still feel the loss of my wife. That for me will not change. And the predictions I'm making will diminish that loss, but it won't include any reconnection with my dead wife. Does that make sense?
And if you'll forgive me for just asking one more follow-up question, then I suppose when I read what you wrote about that, I thought of it as a sort of, so that some sense we might all share somehow, even those consciousnesses that have come and gone in the history of the universe might yet somehow share in this collective consciousness in the future. But perhaps that's not what you actually intended to mean by that.
No, I'm talking about a future collective consciousness, not past consciousness.
In that sense, I suppose for me then, speaking as a Christian myself, John, there is something of a break between your view of what the future will be and my view, where I suppose I conceive of that as being something where, when it talks, symbolically in the book of Revelation about every tear being wiped away and everything being set right in God's time, that there's a sort of sense in which every story the meaning in every story will be manifest. There will be a sort of ultimate reconciliation of all things, all stories, however great or small they were. But evidently that's not the way that you see how that will play out. Perry, I want to pass it over to you now just to get your sense. I don't want to monopolize the sort of the Christian perspective as we start to draw this together. What's your view on where John goes and how you conceive things ultimately, coming out?
Well, you're reminding me of a conversation my dad had with my mom when he had terminal cancer. And he said, well, that verse that says he'll wipe every tear from their eyes. He says, there has to be tears in heaven because I won't have you. And he meant that. In other words, he meant that, even if he's in the afterlife, if he's separated from his wife, he's not entirely happy with that either. And so, he believed that eventually all of those wounds would get healed. I really like the fact that in this book, John's opened the door for people to think about these questions. And if you want to go into questions about is there an afterlife and those sorts of things, there's a lot that you can go study. There's a very large field of near-death experiences and lots that's been written about that. And I would encourage people to do it. I don't remember if you've done any shows on that, Justin, or not.
We've done a few, in that area.
And so, well, I think that very much deserves to be investigated. And it my son was just in a play about a group of students that is killed on a roller coaster, and they're in this middle place between the past life and the afterlife. And one of them is going to get sent back to Earth to continue their life, and the rest of them aren't, and they have to vote as to who gets to go back. And in all human literature, there is this quest for immortality, and this question of immortality that, again, doesn't fit the materialistic narrative at all. And I think you have to ask why.
You do. Obviously, you haven't come to Christian conclusions, John, but you've come to very interesting conclusions that, in a sense, buck against the materialist narrative that is so frequent in the area of study that you are part of, science and so on. And I've really enjoyed having a conversation that sort of just digs into kind of where you land and some of the thoughts you've had on that. Can you conceive any way in which, your philosophy, if you like, of where things are heading could sort of cohere or make sense in a religious framework? Do you go anywhere along with what Perry was talking about, that there could be ways of understanding some of those ancient texts that somehow, marry up to your view of this potential fourth stage of evolution for humans?
I think there are some ancient texts which do, not in quite as explicitly as I do, but do evoke a cosmic consciousness.
Yes. Well, I can think of, some of those traditions that sort of have that sense in them. And there are, also Christian traditions that if you like, play into that as well. The idea of the cosmic Christ and the ultimate sort of summing up of everything, in him. So I wouldn't say, it's obviously that it exists in many religious traditions, including Christianity. But who knows? Well, I've been fascinated by the conversation. We've probably reached as far as we can go into the future as it stands, and it's been delightful to talk to you. Any final thoughts for us, John, as we close out today's show?
No, just to say, I found it fascinating. I haven't done a podcast like this before, and I found it fascinating and enjoyable.
Well, I'm glad.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Pleasure to have you. Perry, any final thoughts from you as we close out?
John, I just want you to salute you for assiduously going after the verifiable facts. You did that in Cosmosapiens, you did it here, and it's all too rare. There's not enough of that in the world, and you brought that in full strength here, and I really appreciate you both.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. There are links to the book from today's show, to Perry as well, if you'd like more from both my guests, John Hand and Perry Marshall. But for now, John and Perry, thanks for being with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.